Sutter Health CPMC. CPMC has served San Francisco for more than 150 years and is proud to open its new Mission Bernal campus in August 2018. Designed as a healing environment, the new hospital has all private rooms, pediatric after-hours care, and the specialists and facilities to provide comprehensive maternity services, including low-intervention and multi-dimensional birth methods. Learn more and take a virtual tour at cpmc2020.org.
From KQED Public Radio in San Francisco, I'm Michael Krasny. In his new book, The Square and the Tower, historian and Hoover Institution senior fellow Niall Ferguson exposes how human networks disrupt power. From the Protestant Reformation to present-day social media movements like Me Too, Ferguson argues that networks have long upset the traditional hierarchies.
Most of history has been characterized by tension between hierarchies and networks. And we're in a classic episode of disruption of hierarchical structure by newly empowered networks.
History of networks and how today's may create a crisis for democracy. That's coming up next. Stay with us. Welcome to Forum. I'm Michael Krasny. Enthusiasts of social networks tout their ability to expose corruption and topple the powerful. But according to historian Niall Ferguson, social networks are disrupting democracy itself. Niall Ferguson joins us this hour to discuss his new book, The Square and the Tower, which lays out a rich history of networks from ancient Roman cults to alliances among the Renaissance Medicis and our current network of connectivity. And he joins us also to discuss his book and why present-day power structures are vulnerable. And welcome back to Forum, Niall Ferguson.
Nice to be back with you, Michael.
Good to have you back, and congratulations on this book. I found it very illuminating and fascinating, and it has an extraordinary canvas, as so many of your books do. I also go along with you. We network folks who are in academia or work in broadcasting and so forth don't really hold the real power. I guess the lesson to take away, one of the lessons that I took away certainly, is the sense that history may belong to the victors, but it also, belongs to the hierarchies and their institutions who create the archives, as you put it.
Right. I mean, I'm a networky kind of person. I always hated hierarchical power structures from the earliest age. I was in open revolt when they put me in the combined cadet corps at my school and put me in a uniform. I've never liked structures of power that have a sort of pyramid-like quality with the big, strong chief executive or commanding general at the top. On the other hand, for most of human history, hierarchical structures of power, beginning with clans and tribes and going right down to modern-day superstates, have tended to dominate social networks. So for most of history, the people like us who like to be in relatively horizontal network structures haven't had the power, and the power has been in the hands of the people at the top of those hierarchical pyramids.
And you really pretty much demonstrate that in so many ways. I mean, you take us on a historical journey, as you say, from Gutenberg to Zuckerberg. I mean, this is pretty expansive, what you're seeing here and what you're dealing with in the historical sweep that you have.
Well, I wanted to write a history book partly for Silicon Valley. As you know, Michael, I moved to California less than a year and a half ago. My first impressions, being now based at Stanford rather than Harvard, of Silicon Valley were that they really cared nothing for history, and that the conversations essentially implied that history had begun with the Google IPO. And when I tried to talk about anything before that, people glazed over. So I thought I'll write a book to show them that history applies to them as much as it applied to the equally arrogant people in Wall Street 10 years ago when I was writing The Ascent of Money just before the financial crisis. I think that the key issue here is that there were two periods in the past which resemble our own. One about which I say relatively little because I just don't have the expertise is the period of the great monotheistic religions, Christianity and later Islam, which clearly spread virally through social networks, despite the fact that there was no sophisticated technology in those times. The one I focus on much more because I know more about it, is the period after the printing press arrived in Europe and allowed Luther's message of dissent from the Roman Catholic hierarchy to spread virally throughout Germany and then throughout Europe. And I think there's a really important set of lessons to be learned from what happened in the 16th and 17th centuries. I mean, we're going back 500 years, or 501 to be exact, because it was in 1517 that Luther launched the Reformation. And yet that seems like the period most like our own. And that's the period I want Silicon Valley and everybody else, of course, to learn from.
Well, I guess Eric Schmidt has learned some things. He gave you a plug in this book.
He did. I mean, look, I'm not an arrogant person. I'm actually rather modest when it comes to my capacity to understand network science, much less computer engineering. So I ran this book past a bunch of people who do know about that stuff, including Eric Schmidt, and he read it and said, rather surprised, "Gosh, you do actually seem to understand this," and that was reassuring. And he's said this was the history lesson that Silicon Valley needed. So the book tries to do two things. It really tries to bridge two worlds. One is the historical world with which I'm familiar. The other is this world of network science, which I decided I really needed to learn about. And I think when you put those two things together, you find some very interesting things, not the least of which is that if you do build giant social networks, and we've done it online, but we've done it in the past with different technologies, don't expect them to be happy, homogenous communities where everybody just shares cat videos, or the 16th century equivalent. Giant social networks, lesson number one for me, tend to polarize. They tend to actually form hostile clusters. And I think that happened in the 16th and 17th centuries with spectacular and often violent results. I'm afraid it's happened in our time, although in the realm of politics rather than of religion.
Yeah, you make this abundantly clear, how social media has promoted kind of polarization. The internet is, as I said in the introduction, maybe a bigger threat to democracy than any would have conceived. I've always been kind of both startled and alarmed by the naivete of some of those leaders. I'm thinking particularly of Zuckerberg. You know, it was all kind of kumbaya and we'll bring connectivity and peace to the world. And what you show here is that networks often are very disruptive, and they bring all kinds of changes, both good and bad.
I think right back to the 1990s, the Kool-Aid dispensed in Silicon Valley essentially led you to expect everything to be awesome if we were all connected. I mean, that was the message.
That was the key word, too.
It would be awesome if everybody were simply connected in a network, then we'd be able to solve everything from climate change to inequality. And I don't think Mark Zuckerberg originated that rhetoric, but he's certainly come to be a master of it. And I think he's probably quite sincere when he says that he set out, or at least decided in the course of building Facebook, to create a global community. But I do think that he and those who advise him have underestimated the extent to which building large online social networks has risks attached to it. And the risks are really a central theme of the book. I mentioned one already, which is polarization. This tendency which the network scientists call homophily, for us to flock together, you know how birds of a feather flock together. Well, it's the same on the internet. The conservatives go to one cluster and liberals to another, and these clusters
and extremists to another.
And the more extreme, the more you get retweeted, the more you get liked. This is a really striking feature of social networks today, that they positively encourage extreme views. We also talk a lot about fake news, and I think that illustrates an important point about networks. Stuff goes viral, not necessarily because it's true. It goes viral because it's engaging. And the network platforms like Facebook, also Google, are set up to promote engagement. But the trouble is, we are very engaged by things that are untrue but interesting, like the Pope endorses Donald Trump, a classic fake news story from 2016. Completely untrue, but it got a huge amount of attention online. So I think we have set up giant machines, and Facebook's only the most important of them, to promote extreme views as well as fake news. And we shouldn't be surprised that our body politic seems so polarized. I think that although that polarization predates the internet in some ways, that the social networks, social media, have undoubtedly enhanced the polarization, and I don't see any sign of that stopping.
But networks do tend to not only innovate, that's how revolutionary ideas spread, isn't it?
Yeah. The book is not an anti-networks book, I should make clear. It's a book that tries to set out how far history is essentially a kind of tug of war between hierarchical structures and decentralized network-based structures. And the point I make about the events after 1517 is that the Reformation, although it led to a great deal of upheaval, had all kinds of positive consequences as well. I mean, it greatly enhanced literacy in any country where the Reformation took hold, to give just one example. And once people could read the Bible or Luther's sermons, well, they could read anything. And it's not surprising that after the Reformation, there was a succession of waves of innovation in the realm of ideas, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and then the political revolutions in North America and France that really were possible because a network of intellectuals had been created who could share their ideas across oceans via publication and correspondence. I talk about that network of Enlightenment thinkers, drawing incidentally on some fantastic work on social network analysis being done at Stanford. I want to make it clear that quite a lot of this book is based on the kind of academic research that doesn't tend to get much airtime, but I think it's laid a foundation of really interesting methodologies for thinking analytically about how networks work. So yeah, networks are often the source of creativity. A world without networks would be a very sterile world. But I think we who have become networked need to be aware of the downside risks. We shouldn't exaggerate the benefits of networks, and we shouldn't pretend that we can organize the world on the basis of Facebook or solve the world's problems with hashtags. That's an illusion.
Sometimes it's very difficult to tell the network from the hierarchy.
Correct. I mean, indeed, it is a bit of a false dichotomy. The book's called The Square and the Tower, and that implies a dichotomy. But as I show, in fact, there's really a continuum from very hierarchically organized networks to very decentralized or distributed ones. And indeed, you can go from one end of that continuum to the other very fast. I show how some apparently network-based organizations, as soon as they became powerful, flipped and became extraordinarily hierarchical. A good example is the Bolshevik Party. As a revolutionary force, it was an extraordinary network, and Lenin's ideas went viral in Russia in 1917. As soon as the Bolsheviks had power, they created one of the most hierarchical structures of government ever.
So what does this do for you as a historian in terms of the old, you talk about the tension that exists and has existed so many centuries now between hierarchies and networks, but the tension that historians have between the individual figure as looming in history preeminently as opposed to historical forces which are part of the milieu, part of the civilization, culture, and so forth. And I raise that question because when you mention somebody like Lenin or Luther, these are individuals who had a great deal to do with spreading essentially the network and creating the network.
But as John Donne said, no man is an island. And the reality about any successful revolutionary or any powerful leader is that they're only as powerful as their network makes them. So part of what I find really rewarding about applying network science to history is that we can establish much more meaningful definitions of importance, indeed of power, than are possible when language is used vaguely. The great thing about being able to map a network is that you can identify not just who was important in terms of, I don't know, the biographies that were written about them. We can establish who was important in terms of how connected they were to other people in the movement. And a good example of this is the American Revolution. We all think of it as having been led by George Washington or Alexander Hamilton, now made famous by a musical. But when you look at the network of revolutionaries, as I do in the book, Paul Revere and Joseph Warren stand out as crucial figures in the network that made that revolution begin, particularly in the Boston area. And in that sense, I think what the network analysis allows you to do is sometimes to correct our historical impressions of who really mattered. This is an age where the cult of personality has swept through the media. They may not believe he's a great man, but most journalists cannot help but report on events in the United States as if Donald Trump is the most important person. And much less thought seems to me to go into the structure of politics in America today, and far too much attention gets paid to one individual. So, if anything, this book is designed to say, don't fall for the great man theory of history. No man is an island, and no man is powerful, no woman for that matter is powerful, without connections to a whole bunch of other people that you may not not hear so much about.
The consummate hierarchical power in our time, Stalin, yeah?
Stalin, I think, was the ultimate hierarchical ruler in the sense that everything had to go through him. Steve Kotkin has this wonderful new biography showing how Stalin obsessively monitored communications. They didn't have a great telephone network in the Soviet Union. It was just the right size for Stalin to be able to tap more or less any call that he wanted to. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, you couldn't even have a chance encounter without Stalin's being suspicious. I tell this lovely story, tragic in some ways, of Isaiah Berlin's meeting
this woman poet
with Anna Akhmatova, one of the great poets of the Soviet Union, who had fallen foul of Stalin on more than one occasion. Well, they had a sort of brief encounter in her apartment one night, platonic rather than sexual, I'm fairly confident, and they talked about literature and art. It's one of the great intellectual meetings of minds of the 20th century. But Stalin gets to hear of it and begins or resumes the persecution of Akhmatova and her family. And that illustrates my point, that it's possible, if you concentrate power and communications in your hands enough, to make social networks illegal. Social networking without the authority of the state in Stalin's Russia was a crime that could land you in a labor camp or even in front of a firing squad.
This is why Stalin has become a major model for Kim Jong-un and was, by the way, a major model for Saddam Hussein. And we're talking, if you've just joined us, with Niall Ferguson, now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and author of The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power, From the Freemasons to Facebook. I ought to mention that he will be at the Commonwealth Club this evening at 6:30 and at Kepler's in Menlo Park on the 29th. And let's talk about the title. We go to Italy, yeah?
To Siena. I was struggling for a title. I knew I couldn't call it networks and hierarchies because I was told hierarchies is just not a word that gets used on, even on NPR, at least not very often.
Universities, it's used.
But it was therefore important to come up with something snappier. And I suddenly realized what it was, the square and the tower. The public square is where we network, whether in markets or in informal conversations. The tower is where power resides in many cities. But the place that somehow encapsulates it is Siena, where the architecture of the 1300s is still intact today. And it's an absolutely perfect juxtaposition. You have the Piazza del Campo and then the Torre del Mangia, which overshadows it. And that was a place I visited, I think as a postgraduate, and it stuck to me as a place, as did the extraordinary murals, the frescoes inside the Palazzo Pubblico, which are often described as the allegories of good and bad government. And they too make this point because they juxtapose tyranny, hierarchical government, with a more networked kind of government in a republic. And I remember going back there with my eldest son after I'd finished the book, but just to make sure my memory wasn't playing me false, and being absolutely exhilarated to realize that in the fresco depicting good government, the citizens of the ideal town are portrayed as being connected by a just visible thread. So they are a network of citizens. I think the period of the Trecento kind of got it. And we need to be reminded of that fundamental tension depicted in Siena between tyranny, bad government with all its pathologies, and good government, which is based ultimately on a network of citizens, albeit in some kind of hierarchical relationship to the Republic's government.
Again, the book we're talking about, Niall Ferguson's new book, is called The Square and the Tower, and there's some really lovely plates in here and illustrations. Reminds me of Walter Isaacson's book, which we talked about on Da Vinci, because he was
which is a brilliant book.
It is a brilliant book, and so is yours. And they're both really beautiful books too, I must say, in the way they're constructed and the kind of plates that you have and illustrations here. I want to bring up something else just that's timely. Senator Dianne Feinstein and Representative Adam Schiff have written a letter just this week demanding that Twitter and Facebook investigate whether bots and Russian trolls try to manipulate public opinion on their sites, and this has been a big question. But they're also concerned about the so-called Release the Memo campaign that we're hearing about right now, a memo that supposedly talks about what was done, again, during the Obama administration and surveillance, and so it goes back and forth. Yeah.
I think there's this slow realization in Washington, D.C., in the political class, the public sphere itself has fundamentally changed with the rise of the network platforms. 45% of Americans now get their news from Facebook. The extent to which political debate has migrated from mainstream conventional media onto these platforms was greatly underestimated by most professional politicians. And only gradually, after the shock of the 2016 result, did it become clear just how far those network platforms had been crucial in the outcome. Now, I think the Russian story is only sort of gradually emerging. It took a while for Facebook to admit, for example, just how many fake Russian accounts had been active using Facebook advertising, clearly to reach American voters. And we now know, although it took a while for this to come out, that almost as many, if not more people, saw Russian advertisements as voted in the election. So it's somewhere around 140 to 150 million people on Facebook or Instagram saw this Russian-made content and had no idea it was Russian in origin. Twitter's admitted recently the extent to which bots have been a source of Russian-originated misinformation. That comes as no surprise to anybody who's looked closely at their own Twitter feed. I mean, for example, you can find out how many people follow you on Twitter who are bots. And I was rather shocked to find that a rather substantial proportion of people following me, I forget the exact proportion, but it was certainly north of 20%, appear not to be real people. I don't know whether they're Russians, but they're not real people. That probably explains why some of what they write is ungrammatical or makes no sense. So I do think that the political class is gradually waking up to the reality that the game has been changed by Facebook and Twitter and Google's affiliate YouTube. But what the political class has not yet done is work out what to do about it. Apart from a rather desultory conversation on the left about antitrust, there is almost, I think, no coherent discussion in Washington about how to deal with the fact that our entire political system has been revolutionized by social networks online. Not only revolutionized, but I think destabilized. Incidentally, Michael, I don't think Russia's the key to all of this. I don't think the Russian intervention was large enough to really have decided the election. But I do think...
But they're meddling with other elections throughout Europe.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they're still at it. I expect they're at it in Brazil and I expect in Mexico and I'm sure in Italy.
They're even at it as we speak now in terms of trying to present the Trump administration in a more favorable light. And you have to wonder what that's all about.
This is a global phenomenon and this is only a part of Russia's strategy. But I think we should recognize that this isn't just a problem arising in Russia. I think there is a more indigenous problem, if you like, or endogenous, to be more precise, problem. Most of the content generated about the election on Facebook and Twitter was not generated by the Russians. Overwhelmingly, it was generated by Americans. And the extreme views and fake news would certainly have been going on even if Vladimir Putin had taken no hand in the elections. I think the key story here is not that Russia swung it. I think it is that without Facebook and Twitter and probably also Google, I do not think Donald Trump would have won the election. Because in a conventional pre-social networks election, if this election had been run on 2008 rules, I'm pretty sure Hillary Clinton would have won it.
We're going to invite you to join the program with Niall Ferguson. He is with us in studio, senior fellow now at the Hoover Institution, and has a new book out called The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook. You can learn more than you ever imagine about the Illuminati and groups like that. Feel free to join the program. It's a toll-free number, 866-733-6786, the number to call. Again, you can join us now at 866-733-6786. Or if you have questions or comments you'd like to bring to the conversation, email them to us, forum@kqed.org, or post them on our website, kqed.org/forum, and click on the segment, or tweet us. Our Twitter handle is @KQED Forum. You can also go to our Facebook page. You're listening to Forum on KQED. I'm Michael Krasny. This is Forum. I'm Michael Krasny. We're spending this hour with Niall Ferguson, who has a new book out, and the book is called The Square and the Tower, subtitled Networks and Power from Freemasons to Facebook. He'll be at the Commonwealth Club this evening at 6:30 and at Kepler's in Menlo Park on the 29th, and you are cordially invited to join this discussion. Our toll-free number is available. It's 866-733-6786, or you can email thoughts and comments to us, forum@kqed.org. And you can also go to our website, kqed.org/forum. want to get into a lot of stuff with you. I want to talk, and I hope time permitting, to talk with you about Davos and to talk with you about some of the things you've written about in your blog, Bankies and Hedgies going to war, and also an interview that you did in the New York Times book review. But let me bring our callers into this because we've raised a lot of, I think, important questions with respect to your book, and I'd like to hear what they have to say or ask. And Rob, we start with you. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning. Thank you. Your guest just mentioned the thing that first popped into my mind, which is the fact that these companies like Facebook, they are a total monopoly. There is no competing website or anything similar to Facebook, and if there does become one, they buy them up. So how is this allowed to happen where there's absolutely no regulation on something that is so immensely influencing the world?
I think this is a great question because without quite meaning to, Mark Zuckerberg's become the most powerful content publisher in American history, perhaps in world history.
Well, he says he's backing off now. They've put out this new edict on news,
That's right. The news feed is getting tweaked. But the fact is that he can tweak that algorithm however he likes. That is the extent, really, of the regulation at the moment. It's self-regulation because under legislation that predates Facebook, going back to the mid-1990s, technology companies like Facebook, network platforms, are exempt from the kind of liabilities that regular content publishers in traditional media are subject to. And that exemption means that there isn't a level playing field when it comes to the regulation of Facebook, or for that matter, Google. This is a great concern because, of course, as is well known, and you mentioned it yourself, there's a kind of duopoly now in terms of online advertising. Facebook and Google dominate that space. That has profound economic implications for traditional media. But I think the bigger issue here is that because of that exemption from liability, Facebook and, for that matter, Google can always say, well, it's nothing to do with us. We didn't produce this content. We're not liable for it. And that, I think, is the big regulatory anomaly. I think it would be very hard to break these companies up in the way that Standard Oil or AT&T in the past were breaking up. I think antitrust actions against any of the big technology companies are quite likely to fail. A, because there are natural monopolies in these so-called two-sided markets that tend to dominate the technology space. B, because the way we think about antitrust is that you have to show the consumers are hurt by this. And you can see Jeff Bezos' smile when this issue comes up in any interview, because he knows that they can show that the consumer benefits from the existence of the big tech companies. After all, Facebook's free.
You took the words out of my mouth.
So I think antitrust is a blind alley. It's not going to work. The key issue is, can you end the exemption from liability under what was the Communications and Decency Act of the mid-90s? Section 230 is the big anomaly in this space. I think once they became liable for the content that appeared and they stopped being regarded as technology platforms and started being regarded as content publishers, then real constraints would start to be imposed. But at the moment, I don't take very seriously the self-regulation that's going on. We've hired 10,000 people to monitor content. We're going to tweak the news feed so that we no longer favor media, we favor family and friends. I don't believe that's fundamentally going to change the game. Unless something changes much more significant than that, then essentially Facebook and the other network platforms will play the same role in the midterms as they played in the presidential election of 2016.
Let me thank the caller and move right along to another caller. Larry, that's you. You're on the air.
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me. Very fascinating topic. Earlier in the program, mention was made that Mark Zuckerberg underestimated how Facebook could be utilized in the manner which it has been utilized in the 2016 election and other events. Is it a question of underestimation or just a grotesque naivete regarding Zuckerberg and other technology companies, that technology would always be used for the benefit of mankind and for good? And if that's not the case, if there is a possibility for evil intent, what type of governance can be put into place early on to prevent the type of thing that happened in 2016 from happening again with other technologies? Thank you.
Thanks. Great hard-hitting question. I used to joke that the problem with Mark Zuckerberg was that he dropped out of Harvard before he took any of my classes. But, I can't help but admire what he has achieved. And I think we see in Facebook's current predicament the results of a strange combination I think naivety. I think he sincerely believed that if everybody was connected, it would be awesome and there'd be a global community. But also the profit motive kicked in. And I think once Facebook and Google realized that online advertising was the way to being billionaires, the way to making their companies the biggest or amongst the biggest on the planet, then I think a certain amount of caution went out the window. Because if you are in the business of selling advertising online through your platform, then your number one priority becomes showing the people who are buying the advertising that users are engaged with the content on your platform. And user engagement is the priority. As long as that's the case, then I think the incentives for Facebook and indeed for Google, YouTube, etc., the incentives are not to prioritize truth. The incentive is to prioritize what is engaging to users. And if that includes Russian-generated content that inflames American opinion on the eve of an election, then that's just the way the algorithm works. Terribly sorry. Now, that I think is the best way of understanding why Facebook got into this mess. There was a certain naivety, as your caller says, but there was also this relentless focus on what are now billions of dollars of advertising revenue every quarter. What could change this game? I mentioned it earlier. I think there has to be a level playing field for anybody producing content in any medium, especially when it comes to politics. You can't have things that are essentially political advertisements appearing with no acknowledgement of their source. Now, that is going to be fixed. The question is whether that will really make a difference. Are we really going to say, oh, well, I'm just going to ignore that because it's obviously from a political organization. I'm just going to ignore that because it seems to have been made in Russia. My hunch is that will not radically alter the situation. The reality is that Facebook advertising is the most powerful tool in democratic politics in the world today. And in any election, I think it's the candidate who figures out how to use that tool that's going to win versus the conventional old-school politician who's still trundling on to television to give interviews.
Well, as long as you're talking about using tools, don't you think also that part of the calculus of this is a belief, a kind of almost total belief in the algorithms and what they can do and render?
That's certainly the culture that has been dominant in these companies. In the hierarchy within the network platforms, and there is a hierarchy, it's definitely the software engineers who are at the top. And I think a certain arrogance crept into the culture. You've probably talked about it in different contexts on this show. But the arrogance that says, we have this algorithm, it's secret, it decides on the newsfeed, it's the source of our billions. That arrogance, I think, was what preceded the crisis. When I first started talking about these issues in Silicon Valley a couple of years ago, the response was, oh, don't be so absurd. But the election has exposed that they had become far too powerful and were essentially irresponsible about that power. And the number of former Facebook executives now lining up to do mea culpas is into double figures. And I think it's very revealing that former Facebook people, some of them quite senior, are going as far as to say, we knew that we were creating an addictive app. We knew that people were going to get hooked on Facebook. I think what they didn't appreciate, cynical as they may have been about the psychology of social networks, was that the networks could be hacked by malicious actors. It's only a few years ago that we were being told at the time of the Arab Spring that actually these social networks would be helpful to democracy and extremely damaging to dictators. Well, it turns out it's not quite that simple. And smart dictators, in fact, more adept at using social networks than democratic politicians.
Yeah, I'll read a comment here from a listener, Marte, who says the French Revolution ended up with Napoleon and the Russian Revolution ended up with Stalin, but the English restored the monarchy and rejected Cromwell. Don't power vacuums historically end up with dictators? Didn't the English retain their monarchy by limiting it?
That's a great question. The book really tries to show that if you really overshoot in terms of network revolution, then the pendulum swings the other way. And that happened in France. The French Revolution, which was like the American Revolution in the sense that a network of of critics of royal rule prevailed, ran out of all control, and by the middle of the 1790s, France was in the grip of a combination of terror and coercion. The chaos of that period ultimately led to Napoleon's essentially saying, "I alone can fix this," and that's often what happens.
That's what we heard from Donald Trump.
Well, I quoted that line deliberately because I think there's an analogy here. In the midst of chaos, if you sense that disruption has gone too far, you start to look for the strong leader that can fix it. That's what happened in France. And I say in the book that Bonaparte, who was the ultimate control freak, tried to run everything in France and then in Europe when he controlled most of Europe in the belief that he alone could run it, right down to the design of the buttons on the uniforms of his soldiers. He was the ultimate micromanaging workaholic. But it seemed that that was the only way to run France because you'd allowed this democratic experiment to happen and it had gone horribly wrong. For most of the 19th and right into the middle of the 20th century, the default setting for organisation was in fact centralised power. That culminated in Stalin, but I think it originated in Napoleon.
You are welcome to join us with Niall Ferguson. Again, the number to call, 866-733-6786, or email us, forum@kqed.org, or go to our website, kqed.org/forum. His new book is called The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook. I said that I wanted to talk with you about some other things. We'll go into this whole relationship and tension between the network and the hierarchy some more. But I was interested in your blog when you were talking about bankies and hedgies, as you call them, going to war. And this is all in the wake of Davos taking place. And I guess Melania, the First Lady, is not going to Davos, but the President is going to Davos. And there's all this talk now also about, since we talk about the bankies and the hedgies, I want to get you on the record on that, but there's all this talk about Deutsche Bank and about frankly, Russian banks in terms of the Mueller investigation and where those might go, and money laundering and so forth. I mean, at this point, there's a lot of smoke. I wouldn't say there's perhaps much fire, but the reality is the investigation is moving in those directions.
Right, and I think that it's extremely important for your listeners to realize that the networks that played a part in the election and continue to play a part in American politics, and not just the online social networks that Donald Trump learnt to have such an influence over, or the cable networks that he also learnt how to have an influence over. There's also the business network. And that business network, which is global and far from transparent, the network of the Trump organization, certainly has connections to Russia and to other former Soviet republics, the full extent of which I think will likely be a focal point of the Mueller inquiry. Now, when I was writing the book, I was reflecting on how much of my early work had been about business networks, and I'd kind of written about the Rothschild banking network. I'd written a bit about George Soros's network in The Ascent of Money, but I hadn't really formally analysed network structures in the way that I do in this book. So I was able to revisit the Soros network and the Rothschild network in this book and think a little bit more systematically about it. The Trump network's really interesting in this respect. You know, a lot of the media coverage of Trump's going to Davos is, I think, naively focusing on the rhetoric of Trump, which is essentially anti-free trade, anti-globalization, as opposed to the realities of Trump's identity as a businessman.
And where his money is.
And where his money is and has been. And although it may seem that he's an outsider at Davos because his language has always been at odds with the Davos consensus, which is pro-free trade and pro-immigration and all the rest of it, but if you strip away the rhetoric, Davos is a gathering of businessmen. It's Jamie Dimon has this great line about Davos is where billionaires tell millionaires how the middle class feels. Donald Trump may not have been on the A-list. I don't suspect he have never even got an invitation to Davos till he became president. But he's much closer to this network of global business than many of his followers, many of his voters would like to believe. I don't think he'll go to Oleg Deripaska's legendary Davos party, but he could. After all, they both employed Paul Manafort.
That's right. Well, I'm going to go to more calls and emails in just a moment, but I did promise I wanted to get into something else. There's an interview with Niall Ferguson, our guest in a recent New York Times book review, where they always ask, what is on your nightstand, is the first question, and where Niall comes clean about researching. Reminded me a little bit of Gore Vidal. When somebody comes out critically, he does the research and finds out as much as he can about that person. But I was struck by, you mentioned liking hillbilly elegy, and you mentioned you spoke supportively about Charles Murray because you essentially said a lot of people don't understand him, and we did an event with Ralph Nader and Charles Murray where I had to act as a kind of referee, like in a boxing ring between you and Nader. That's a whole other story. But you also said that Thomas Piketty is overrated and conceptually unsound and tediously executes. Not mincing your words there. I was struck by that, and I'd like to ask you to opine on that a little bit more, because there are a lot of people who really appreciate and revere even Piketty. But also, you mentioned a novel, and as a literary person, I was quite interested because I never heard of this novel, 2084, an Algerian writer, and you were quite enthusiastic about that. So I'd like to ask you, first talk about the Algerian novel, and then maybe talk about Piketty, or do the reverse if you prefer.
2084 is an amazing book, which hasn't, I think, received nearly enough attention. It's essentially an update of Orwell, as the name implies, but it's set in a future totalitarian regime that is clearly organized on the basis of political Islam, although it's encoded so that it's not explicitly said to be Islam. And this notion of a totalitarianism based on Sharia and the pathologies that would likely arise from that, I think, is extraordinarily powerful. It's a wonderfully written book, and I highly recommend it to your listeners. Piketty's book got tremendous attention when it was published, but I think its central thesis was wrong. And the central thesis is essentially that there's a kind of natural law that drives inequality because of a differential between the rate of profit and the rate of growth. And I think if you want to understand the problems of inequality that have become so politically salient in our time, you'd get much more out of Charles Murray's book Coming Apart, which is a much more subtle work on inequality, than out of Piketty's, which is rather unsubtle.
And you know, of course, that Murray is vilified, particularly in academia.
Well, Charles Murray's
vilified, more by, let's say, the left, obviously, than those who are more in the center or conservative, but very strongly controversial, to put it mildly.
I think Charles Murray's always going to be vilified by those people who took amiss a book he wrote many years ago, The Bell Curve. And I think most of the people who now throw themselves into fits of fury about him haven't read that book or any other book by him. But, you know, the most recent work that he's done seems to me to be extraordinarily valuable. Coming Apart was the best analysis, and this was written, I think, 5 years before the election, much the best analysis of the kind of drivers of inequality in the United States today, and it very presciently saw why a white working class backlash was imminent, backlash against establishment political verities from globalization to multiculturalism. So I got much more out of that than out of Piketty. That's not to disrespect the work that Piketty's done with Emmanuel Sayers on income distribution and wealth distribution over the ages. That's important work. But I think there's a big problem with Piketty's book, which is that essentially he says, well, this is all terrible, but we could fix it with a global wealth tax. Whereas in reality, the greater equality of the mid-20th century that their data show was the result of 2 world wars, a Great Depression, multiple hyperinflations, and all kinds of other alarms and excursions. The notion that there's a simple fix, a fiscal fix that can get you back to 1950 in terms of income and wealth distribution just strikes me as the kind of thing that economists have a tendency to come up with that's rather unhistorical. I mean, I can get you back to 1950, but you'll have to have at least 1 world war to get there, because that's really the only way that it was possible to compress income differentials and to compress wealth differentials in the way that happened in the 1930s and 1940s.
We'll bring another of our callers aboard, and we go to you. Decker, you're on the air.
Good morning.
Morning.
I was wondering if your guest could relate Cold War espionage with how he views what's happened with Facebook and other social media.
Yes, I could, and the book does. One of the things that I really enjoyed writing is the section on the book which describes how the Russian intelligence services penetrated one of the most exclusive and intellectually elite networks of all time, which was the Apostles, the Cambridge University intellectual society, that in the 1930s was very successfully penetrated by Soviet agents, to the extent that 3 out of the 5 Cambridge spies were members of the Apostles. The Russians have, as they say, got form. They have long understood the ways in which networks can be hacked, because this is a problem with networks that is often, I think, overlooked, and it explains why hierarchies tend to dominate networks in history. They're not very easily defended. Network security is almost an oxymoron. We discovered how easily the political elites' networks could be hacked in 2016 when John Podesta's emails were downloaded by Russians and essentially released through WikiLeaks in a tremendously successful operation from a Russian vantage point. But this is not a new phenomenon. The problem with networks is that they're not very good at security. And if you think your organization is going to solve that problem with two-factor authentication, I've got a bridge to sell you.
And you're listening to Forum. We're talking with Niall Ferguson. This is a fundraising period for KQED Public Radio. For more information about how to support this radio station, and we certainly urge you to do that, simply go to kqed.org. And I'm Michael Krasny. Let me go to some comments here. John writes, even before the Gutenberg press, the troubadours in the 13th and 14th century broadcast current events from court to court. This was the social media of the time.
Absolutely. The social media, or if you like, social networks, have always existed and exist even in the most unpropitious of settings. That argument's important because it's a way of pushing back against the excessive technological determinism that exists in Northern California. You actually don't need smartphones and the internet to have giant social networks. Those networks that we have today are probably bigger and certainly faster than in the past. But even without the printing press, as your listener rightly observes, it was possible for news to travel, both true and untrue news, no doubt, through medieval Europe. It just travelled slowly, in the same way that viruses, like the one that caused the devastating Black Death, could travel. They travelled more slowly than viruses today, or I should say the bacillus in the case of the Black Death, but they nevertheless could travel right across the Eurasian landmass and wreak havoc. So the issue here is that there hasn't been as much qualitative change in the way that we interact as human beings as the technological determinists would have you believe. Things may go faster, but they basically operate in ways that are familiar.
It's scale and speed, really.
Right. I mean, I roughly estimate in the book that our network revolution, if you want to call it that, has been about an order of magnitude faster than that which the printing press caused. So what took 100 years in the 16th century now takes 10 years. But it's the same process. The fact that it's fast is not trivial. But I don't think we should ignore the past or regard it as irrelevant just because we invented the internet.
Let me go to a couple more questions. Joseph wants to know, will our experiment in representative democracy collapse as more individual voices are heard?
I do worry about that. And I wrote a piece that ran in the Daily Beast a few days ago asking, is there a fundamental threat to democracy posed by the network platforms because of the huge disruption or transformation of the public sphere that they have caused? Now, I'd characterize my current state of mind as being 5 days a week, I think it's okay, and that the United States has institutions resilient enough to withstand this. But 2 days a week, I sort of wake up in a cold sweat thinking maybe it felt like this in the final phase of the Roman Republic. That I think is probably the correct posture and probably the right distribution of anxiety. The American institutions are remarkably strong. They've withstood all kinds of shocks, and they've certainly withstood populist waves in American political history on more than one occasion. But I do think this change in the structure of the public sphere and the way that it essentially incentivizes the circulation of fake news and extreme views is a major threat to democracy. And I think it'll be weaker democracies that suffer the most. So I think one has to look at every election, and this was true last year and indeed in 2016. I think one has to look at every election in the world very closely to see how social media are being used. I was recently in Brazil. It's extraordinary to see what's going on there. Most people are focused on whether Lula makes a comeback or not. I think that may even be decided today. Maybe it's been decided as we speak. But I don't think that's really necessarily the big issue because he's kind of an old school politician. He's not that big on social media. Whereas there's a TV star who dominates social media, a Donald Trump-like figure that without Trump's attitudes. And then there's a chap named Bolsonaro, who's essentially an apologist for military rule, who has extraordinarily large numbers of followers on Facebook. So each election, it seems to me, in the world has the potential to be like November 2016 in the United States, as long as these social network platforms exist as the most powerful tools for electioneering in the world.
We were warned about it by Obama, even though he was a recipient of so much of the victory from it.
I think because he pioneered it and succeeded in doing so, many people on the left relaxed and thought, well, we own this, so naturally it's going to be a liberal tool. Brad Pascal, who was Trump's social media guy, made a very astute comment on this subject in an interview not so long ago, late last year, and he said, the network platforms were designed by liberals in Silicon Valley. It never crossed their mind that conservatives could use those against them. And I think that's one of the sort of epitaphs on the election. It really didn't cross their minds. And when it became clear to Mark Zuckerberg and others that Facebook had played a decisive role in Trump's victory, and indeed that Facebook employees had been there with Pascal designing the adverts to make sure that they hit the targeted demographics, there was a kind of collective freakout, beginning with, oh, it's a crazy idea that we had anything to do with this, to the now painful confessions. Well, actually, as a matter of fact, 146 million people saw Russian content. I mean, I think that process of confession is not over. The full story of the social networks part in the election still, I think, hasn't been told.
The book again, The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook. You can meet Niall Ferguson. He'll be at the Commonwealth Club tonight. He'll be at Kepler's in Menlo Park on the 29th. Good to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
And we're here with you Monday through Friday, 9 to 11, an hour repeat at 10 to 11 in the evening. And stay tuned for more coverage of the news and more of what you can hear on this radio station. It's KQED in San Francisco. I'm Michael Krasny.
Funds for the production of Forum are provided by the members of KQED Public Radio and the Germanicos Foundation and the Generosity Foundation.